I was saving a stranger's life in the emergency room on Christmas Eve when my own family was throwing my 10-year-old daughter out into the freezing night. My parents and my golden child sister looked my little girl in the eye and told her there was absolutely no room for her at their holiday table. They shoved my little girl into a stranger's car and banished her to an empty, unheated apartment just to make room for my white brother-in-law's wealthy parents and their two designer dogs. I did not break down in tears. I did not throw a tantrum. I took immediate, ruthless action. The very next morning, my parents found a thick envelope taped to their custom mahogany front door, and their horrified screams echoed through their entire gated community. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to build your own empire in absolute silence, because the people who were supposed to protect you threw you to the wolves. My name is Nia, and I am 34 years old. If you looked at me on that freezing December night, you would have seen nothing more than an exhausted trauma nurse running on 3 hours of sleep and stale vending machine coffee. You would have smelled the sharp metallic sting of antiseptic mixed with the copper scent of blood clinging to my faded blue scrubs. The emergency room in downtown Atlanta was an absolute war zone on Christmas Eve. The suffocating atmosphere was thick with the frantic beeping of cardiac monitors, the sharp shouts of doctors calling out medication dosages, and the desperate, heartbreaking cries of families waiting in the lobby for miracles that might never come. My sneakers squeaked heavily on the linoleum floor as I pushed through my 14th hour of a brutal double shift. I was busy packing wounds, starting intravenous lines, and holding the frail hands of terrified elderly patients who had nobody else in the world to comfort them during the holidays. My lower back ached intensely and my feet were swollen, but I kept moving because saving lives was my calling. That physical exhaustion and those faded blue scrubs were exactly what my toxic family saw whenever they bothered to look down their noses at me. They saw a tired, underpaid woman who got pregnant at 24, who dropped out of medical school to raise a child, and who settled for what they considered a menial blue-collar job. They saw a massive permanent disappointment to their bloodline. What they did not know, what absolutely nobody in my image-obsessed family even suspected, was that those faded hospital scrubs were a deliberate, carefully maintained disguise. I was not just a nurse scraping by on holiday overtime pay to make rent. I was the sole founder and chief executive officer of Apex Healthcare Staffing and Concierge Network. The business I had built entirely from scratch at my tiny kitchen table while my daughter slept was now a private healthcare empire generating tens of millions of dollars annually. My company provided premium elite medical personnel to exclusive private clinics and high-net-worth clients across the entire East Coast. But I still picked up occasional trauma shifts at the public hospital completely under the radar. Working in the trenches kept me grounded. It kept my clinical skills sharp. Most importantly, it reminded me why I entered the medical field in the first place. I loved the raw, honest work of caring for people in their absolute darkest moments. My family, on the other hand, cared only about status, zip codes, and superficial appearances. My mother, Vivian, was the kind of woman who wore her Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority letters like an aristocratic crest. She treated every single social interaction in Atlanta as a highly calculated transaction. To her, a person's worth was entirely dependent on their lineage, their alumni associations, and their network. My father, Marcus, was no better. He measured human value strictly by bank account balances and the specific prominent names he could drop during his Sunday morning golf games at his exclusive country club. To them, my existence as a single mother working in a public emergency room was a deeply embarrassing stain on their carefully curated social portfolio. And then there was my younger sister, Jasmine. Jasmine was 31 years old, a proud Spelman graduate, and the undisputed golden child of the family. She had a master's degree, a massive diamond ring, and a husband who checked every single one of my parents' superficial boxes. Connor was 33, a white tech entrepreneur from Boston who ran his own medical technology startup. Connor was incredibly arrogant, patronizing, and constantly dropped subtle microaggressions about my neighborhood, my job, and my life choices. He treated me like the hired help, speaking to me with a slow, exaggerated patience, as if my nursing degree made me intellectually inferior to his corporate buzzwords. He would frequently make offhand comments about how public school systems were failing children like mine while boasting about the private academies he planned to send his future children to. My parents not only allowed his blatant disrespect, but actively encouraged it because he represented the venture capital wealth and elite coastal connections they so desperately worshipped. While Connor was busy pitching fake medical technology to gullible investors in air-conditioned boardrooms, I was up to my elbows in actual physical trauma, saving real lives. That Christmas Eve, the stark contrast between my harsh reality and their shallow vanity felt sharper than ever before. We had trauma after trauma coming through the double swinging doors. A massive multi-car pileup on the interstate had flooded our trauma bays with critical patients. I spent my holiday night monitoring rapidly declining vitals coding patients who were slipping away and moving continuously from one life or death crisis to the next without a single moment to catch my breath or drink a sip of water. The only thing that kept me standing, the only thought that kept my hands steady as I worked through the exhaustion, was my beautiful 10-year-old daughter Maya. Maya was brilliant, deeply perceptive, and the absolute center of my universe. She was my reason for breathing. She was my daily motivation for building the apex healthcare empire in the shadows, and my motivation for enduring my family's relentless toxicity at holiday gatherings. That evening, she was supposed to be spending a joyful, warm Christmas Eve at my parents' sprawling mansion in the upscale suburbs. We had a firm concrete agreement. I would push through this brutal holiday shift, saving lives, and the moment I clocked out at 11 o'clock at night, I would drive straight to their gated community to pick her up. I had pictured the scene in my head a dozen times to keep myself motivated through the blood and the tears of the emergency room. I imagined Maya sitting comfortably by their massive stone fireplace, maybe drinking hot cocoa from a festive mug, or opening one early present with her grandparents. I envisioned her face lighting up when I walked through the heavy mahogany front doors, ready to take her back to our real home, so we could wake up together on Christmas morning, just the two of us. I poured every ounce of my energy into my patients that night, believing with all my heart that my family was providing a warm, safe, loving environment for my child. I truly believed that despite their endless flaws and their shallow obsession with social status, they would at least be capable of showing basic human decency to their own granddaughter on a major holiday. I was sacrificing my own physical and mental comfort to keep complete strangers breathing completely unaware that while I was holding the hands of the dying, my own flesh and blood was orchestrating an act of such profound cruelty against my little girl that it would irrevocably destroy our family forever. The sharp smell of antiseptic burned my nose, and the heart monitors beeped in a steady, rhythmic chorus as I finally handed off my patient charts to the incoming night nurse. My grueling shift was officially over. My body was screaming for rest, but I pushed through the bone-deep fatigue, grabbing my car keys with a bright smile on my face, eager to go collect my daughter. I had absolutely no idea I was about to drive straight into a nightmare that would force me to take off my carefully constructed mask and show my family exactly who they were dealing with. The icy Atlanta wind rattled the windows of my beat-up sedan as I navigated the dark highway toward the northern suburbs. I gripped the steering wheel, letting the heater blast against my numb fingers. I kept this old car specifically for these visits, acting as a prop in the elaborate play I maintained to keep my family completely ignorant of my actual wealth. Tonight, it just felt like a freezing tin can. But the physical discomfort did not matter. In 20 minutes, I would finally have my daughter. I imagined Maya curled up on the plush imported rug in my parents' grand living room, the glow of the massive Christmas tree reflecting in her eyes. It was the only reason I allowed them access to her. I harbored a desperate, foolish hope that they could at least play the role of loving grandparents for one single night of the year. I pulled up to the imposing wrought iron gates of their exclusive subdivision, nodding to the security guard who waved me through with a pitying glance at my rattling car. My parents' sprawling colonial mansion sat at the end of a long, manicured cul-de-sac. It was illuminated like a fortress of wealth, every window blazing with warm golden light. I parked on the street, not wanting to stain their pristine driveway with a potential oil drip, and practically sprinted up the sweeping stone steps. I reached for the heavy brass handle, fully expecting the door to swing open into a wall of festive warmth. It was locked tight. I frowned, pulling my thin jacket tighter around my scrubs. They knew exactly what time my shift ended. I knocked, the sound echoing hollowly against the solid wood. Nothing. I knocked harder, my knuckles stinging in the biting cold. Through the frosted glass panels, I could see shadows moving, the flicker of a massive fireplace, and the distinct outline of guests holding crystal glasses. I pulled out my phone and dialed my mother's number. It rang 4 times before dropping to voicemail. A hard, cold knot formed in my stomach. I dialed my father. Voicemail again. Panic, sharp and metallic, began to rise in my throat. I dialed Jasmine. She answered on the 5th ring, the sound of smooth jazz and clinking silverware flooding the line. "What do you want?" Jasmine snapped, her voice dripping with extreme annoyance. "We are entertaining." "I am standing outside, Jasmine," I said, forcing my voice to remain perfectly level despite the hammering of my heart. "Unlock the door. I am here to pick up Maya." There was a prolonged, heavy silence on the line. I heard Jasmine sigh, the kind of exaggerated, put-upon exhale someone makes when dealing with a minor inconvenience. "Maya is not here, Nia." The wind howling across the porch suddenly felt like ice water in my veins. "What do you mean she is not there?" I demanded, my professional hospital composure fracturing. We had a concrete agreement. "Where is my daughter?" "Lower your voice," Jasmine hissed, stepping away from the background noise. Connor's parents decided to fly down from Boston a day early. They wanted to surprise us for Christmas Eve. They brought all their vintage Louis Vuitton luggage and their 2 standard poodles. We needed the guest room cleared out immediately. The house was complete chaos, and we simply could not have Maya underfoot while we were trying to host important high-net-worth guests. My brain struggled to process the sheer, unadulterated cruelty of her words. "You put a 10-year-old child out of the house on Christmas Eve. Oh, please stop being so dramatic." Jasmine scoffed, her tone dripping with upper-class condescension. "We called a premium Uber and sent her back to your apartment about 2 hours ago. The driver had 5 stars. She has a key, does she not? Your daughter needs to learn how to be independent. You cannot expect us to act as unpaid babysitters when we have VIP guests to accommodate." Connor's mother is extremely particular about where her dogs sleep, and we needed the closet space for their travel crates. I stood freezing on the stone porch of their multi-million-dollar estate, staring blindly at the warm light spilling through the windows. They had kicked my 10-year-old daughter out into the freezing night. They had shoved a little girl into a stranger's car and banished her to an empty, dark apartment. And they did it to make room for 2 dogs. They had prioritized the comfort of their wealthy white in-laws' pets over the basic safety of their own flesh and blood. I did not scream. I did not hurl insults or beg for an explanation. I hung up the phone, turned around, and walked back to my car. The drive back into the heart of Atlanta was a chaotic blur of neon lights and dark, treacherous highways. I shattered every speed limit, my hands gripping the steering wheel with such force that my joints ached. I had skipped meals during nursing school to buy my parents lavish birthday gifts they never appreciated. I had worked holidays for years to ensure Maya never felt the sting of poverty they constantly projected onto us. I prayed silently, desperately, that Maya was safe, that the driver had actually dropped her off, that she had managed to unlock the heavy security door of my old building. I had kept my old, cramped apartment in the city strictly as a decoy, using it whenever my family insisted on dropping by, so they would never discover the multi-million-dollar luxury penthouse I actually owned. The decoy apartment was in a gentrifying but rough neighborhood with bare minimum heating, thin windows, and drafty, dimly lit hallways. I abandoned my car at the curb and practically ripped the heavy building door off its hinges. I sprinted up 3 flights of stairs, ignoring the burning in my lungs. I fumbled with my keys, dropped them, cursed, and finally jammed the brass key into the deadbolt. "Maya!" I called out, my voice cracking as I pushed the door open. I rushed into the small, shadowy living room. The air inside was barely a degree warmer than the winter night outside. The building's ancient radiator was clanking uselessly in the corner. There, curled up on the faded, worn-out sofa, was my beautiful daughter. She was wearing her winter coat indoors, her small body shivering violently under a thin, cheap fleece blanket. When she heard my voice, she sat up and rubbed her puffy, tear-stained eyes. "Mom," she whispered, her voice trembling from the cold. I fell to my knees and pulled her into my arms, wrapping my body entirely around hers to share my core warmth. "I am so sorry, baby," I murmured, pressing my face into her freezing hair. "I am so sorry they did this to you. Are you okay? Did the driver wait until you got inside?" She nodded, burying her face deep into my shoulder. "He waited. But Grandma and Aunt Jasmine were really mad at me. They told me to grab my backpack and run out the back door so Connor's parents would not see me." Maya paused, taking a shaky breath that shattered my heart. "Grandma said my clothes smelled like cheap laundry detergent, and she did not want the house smelling poor for the holidays." Hearing those exact words fall from the lips of my innocent, precious child was the moment something inside my soul permanently shifted. I held her tight, feeling her small body gradually stop shivering as the initial shock wore off. In the dead silence of that freezing apartment, the very last remaining thread of loyalty I held for my biological family snapped completely. I had spent an entire decade taking their insults. I had endured their relentless, condescending remarks about my nursing career. I had swallowed my absolute pride when Connor made racist, passive-aggressive jokes about my neighborhood. I had tolerated my parents treating me like a shameful, dirty secret because they were my blood. But they had crossed the absolute, unforgivable red line. They had punished my innocent child for the crime of being born to me. I pulled back and looked Maya straight in the eyes. I did not shed a single tear. Tears were for helpless victims, and I was far from a victim. I forced a warm, deeply comforting smile onto my face, projecting absolute safety. "Let us pack up your backpack, sweetie," I said, my voice smoother and calmer than it had been in years. "We are not staying here tonight. We are going to our real home. And tomorrow we are going to give Grandma and Grandpa a Christmas present they will never, ever forget." As Maya hopped up to grab her things, I pulled out my phone and bypassed my standard apps, opening my highly encrypted corporate email. I sent one message to the senior managing partner of my legal team and another to the chief financial officer of my holding company. My instructions were brief, precise, and entirely ruthless. I ordered my legal team to finalize the eviction notices I had kept dormant for 2 years. I commanded my financial officer to instantly sever the crucial vendor contracts that kept my brother-in-law's fragile startup afloat. It was time to execute the financial contingency plans I had quietly and meticulously set up. My family thought they had just casually discarded a pathetic, broke single mother. They believed they could toss us out like trash without a single consequence. They had absolutely no idea they had just declared a full-scale war on the landlord of their entire existence. I took my daughter's warm hand, walked out of that freezing decoy apartment, and prepared to dismantle their perfectly curated lives brick by brick. The morning sun glared off the frost-covered, manicured lawns of my parents' gated community. I did not drive my rusted decoy sedan this time. I took an Uber Black, letting the driver drop me right at the sweeping stone steps of the estate. I was still wearing my wrinkled, faded blue scrubs from the emergency room. A faint smear of dried blood from a car crash victim still stained the hem of my pants. I had not slept a single minute, but the pure, unadulterated adrenaline pumping through my veins made me feel razor sharp. I did not bother ringing the doorbell. I knew the master security code to the front gates and the heavy double doors, because I was the one who secretly paid the security company. I punched in the 6 digits, pushed the heavy mahogany doors open, and stepped directly into the lion's den. The smell of freshly baked croissants, imported espresso, and expensive vanilla candles hit me instantly. From the grand foyer, I could hear the bright ringing sound of crystal glasses clinking and the smooth sound of a holiday jazz playlist floating from the surround sound speakers. They were in the formal dining room celebrating Christmas morning as if they had not just committed an act of unspeakable cruelty hours prior. I walked down the marble hallway, my rubber-soled sneakers squeaking deliberately against the pristine floor. When I turned the corner into the dining room, the picturesque scene before me was enough to make my stomach turn. The massive oak dining table was laden with silver platters of gourmet food. My mother Vivian sat at the head of the table wearing a pristine silk morning robe, her hair perfectly coiffed. My father Marcus was laughing heartily while pouring a mimosa for Connor's father, a stiff-looking man with a perpetual scowl. Connor's mother was seated next to Jasmine feeding pieces of smoked salmon to one of the giant standard poodles sitting right at the table. Jasmine was leaning against Connor, flashing her massive diamond ring every time she gestured. They looked like a catalog spread for generational wealth. I stepped fully into the doorway and let the heavy silence announce my presence. Vivian saw me first. The crystal pitcher in her hand slipped, hitting the edge of a glass with a sharp, piercing crack that instantly silenced the room. The laughter died in my father's throat. Jasmine's smile vanished, completely replaced by a look of sheer unmasked horror. "Merry Christmas," I said, my voice dropping the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. "I hope everyone is enjoying their breakfast." "Nia," my mother hissed, her eyes darting frantically toward Connor's parents. "What on earth are you doing here? And look at you. You are wearing hospital clothes at the dinner table. We have guests." Connor's mother pulled her poodle closer, adjusting her cashmere cardigan as she eyed my wrinkled scrubs with blatant disgust. Connor stood up at his chair, scraping aggressively against the hardwood floor. "Nia, this is entirely inappropriate," Connor said, deploying that patronizing corporate voice he reserved exclusively for me. "We are in the middle of a private family holiday breakfast. You cannot just barge in here looking like you slept in a dumpster. My parents are trying to enjoy their morning." I did not even blink at him. I kept my eyes locked entirely on my mother. "I am not here to exchange holiday pleasantries," I said, taking a slow, deliberate step into the room. "I am here to find out which one of you looked my 10-year-old daughter in the eye and told her to run out the back door like a stray dog." My father slammed his heavy silver fork down onto his porcelain plate. The loud clang echoed through the vaulted ceiling. "Watch your tone in my house," Marcus growled, pointing a thick finger at me. "You will not come in here disrespecting us in front of Preston and Beatrice. You are acting completely unhinged." "Unhinged!" I repeated, letting out a cold, hollow laugh that made Jasmine flinch. "You threw my child into a stranger's car at night because you needed closet space for dogs. You sent her to a freezing apartment without even verifying if she made it inside safely. I found her shivering under a cheap blanket while you were all here drinking imported champagne. And you want to talk to me about being unhinged?" Jasmine crossed her arms over her chest, lifting her chin in that signature gesture of Spelman alumni superiority. She always used to make me feel small. "Oh, please, Nia, you are blowing this way out of proportion as usual," Jasmine sneered. "Maya is perfectly fine. The Uber driver had a spotless record. We simply could not have a child running around touching things and making a mess when we had to prepare the guest wing for Connor's parents. You know how stressful hosting can be." "She is your niece," I said, my voice dropping dangerously low. "And this is my house," Vivian interrupted, standing up to establish her dominance. The silk robe pooled around her ankles. "I will not have you marching in here covered in hospital filth acting like a victim. We did you a favor by letting her stay here in the first place while you worked that low-class shift. If you had a real career, a proper respectable job like your sister instead of being a glorified maid, washing strangers' wounds, you would have been home to take care of your own child. Do not try to blame us for your failures as a mother." The pure venom in Vivian's voice hung in the air. Preston and Beatrice exchanged deeply uncomfortable glances, clearly wishing they were anywhere else. Beatrice leaned over and whispered something to Connor, who nodded and took a step toward me. "Listen carefully, Nia," Connor said, towering over me and invading my personal space to physically intimidate me. "You need to leave. Right now. You are embarrassing yourself and you are upsetting Vivian. Take whatever ghetto attitude you brought in here and walk it right back out the front door. We are done dealing with your drama." I stared up at Connor's red, flushed face, noting the absolute certainty in his eyes. He fully believed he held all the power in this room. He believed my parents would back him up. He believed I was nothing but a broke, tired nurse who would eventually back down and apologize for ruining their perfect morning. I did not back down. I held my ground, refusing to break eye contact. "You are right about one thing, Connor," I said, my voice carrying a lethal calm that finally made the arrogance flicker in his eyes. "I am completely done dealing with this drama, but I am not the one who is going to be leaving." My father let out a harsh, dismissive bark of laughter. "You have lost your mind," Marcus said, waving his hand as if swatting away a fly. "Since the day you got pregnant at 24 and dropped out of medical school, you have been an absolute embarrassment to this family. Look at Jasmine. She has a master's degree. She married a tech chief executive. She brings valuable business contacts to my table. What do you bring, Naya? Nothing but burden and complaints. Get out before I call the security guards to drag you off the property. You are no longer welcome here today." The audacity of his threat, the sheer blind confidence of a man who thought he controlled the entire board, was almost beautiful to witness. They had laid all their cards on the table. They had doubled down on their cruelty, defended their betrayal, and chosen their wealthy white in-laws over their own blood. They had handed me the exact ammunition I needed to detonate the bombs I had planted under their lives. I reached into the deep pocket of my scrub jacket, feeling the thick edges of the legal envelopes waiting inside. "Call security," I challenged him, tilting my head with a razor-sharp smile. "Go ahead, Dad. Call them. Because the moment they get here, they are going to have a very interesting job to do." My mother, Vivian, stood up fully from her intricately carved dining chair, pulling her silk robe tightly around her waist, as if physically shielding herself from my presence. She took 2 deliberate steps toward me, her designer heels clicking sharply like gunfire against the polished hardwood floor. She stopped just inches away, stopping so close I could smell the heavy, expensive floral perfume she always wore to mask the bitterness underneath. From where I stood, she looked like a towering monument of toxic maternal judgment. Her chin was tilted upward, forcing me to look up at her exactly the way she had always positioned our dynamic since I was a little girl. She wanted to physically and psychologically oppress me, to shrink me down into the broken, desperate 24-year-old single mother she had kicked out a decade ago. "You actually think you can stand in my dining room and threaten us?" Nia, my mother, hissed, her voice dropping into that dangerously quiet register she used when she was ready to destroy someone. "You think because you put on those cheap scrubs and play martyr at the hospital that you have some moral high ground over us? Let us get one thing perfectly clear. You are the one who abandoned your daughter on Christmas Eve. You dumped her on our doorstep because you refused to get your life together." I felt a muscle jump in my jaw. I was saving lives, Vivian. I was pulling trauma victims back from the brink of death. I did not abandon my child. We had a firm schedule and you agreed to it. "I agreed to do you a favor because I pitied you." My mother shot back, her eyes narrowing into cold, dark slits. "Do not stand there and twist the narrative to make yourself look like Mother of the Year. If you had a proper job, a real respectable corporate career like your sister, you would not be working the graveyard shift on a major holiday like some common laborer. You could actually afford a reliable nanny. You could afford a decent home in a safe zip code. Instead, you chose to be a glorified bedpan washer, and you expect us to constantly clean up your messes. You expect us to put our lives and our important guests on hold because you cannot afford basic childcare." Her words were designed to cut deep, to hit every single insecurity I used to have about my abilities as a mother. Connor let out a soft snort of agreement from the table, crossing his arms and shaking his head, as if my very existence was a tedious joke. His wealthy white parents, Preston and Beatrice, sat in stunned silence, but their eyes mirrored my mother's absolute disdain. They were watching me like I was a wild animal that had somehow wandered into their exclusive country club. "You have always been like this, Nia," my mother continued, her voice rising in pitch as she fed on her own righteous indignation. "You have always been a relentless, exhausting burden to this family. I tried so hard to mold you into someone respectable. I introduced you to all the right people. I paid for your debutante cotillion. I secured your legacy status so you could pledge my sorority. I set you up perfectly to marry into a good, affluent family. And what did you do? You threw it all straight into the gutter. I did not throw anything away. I said, my voice deadpan and steady. I realized early on that your elite social clubs and your fake society friends were suffocating and entirely meaningless. I wanted to help people. I wanted to actually do something with my life other than gossip at charity luncheons. Oh, please spare me the self-righteous poverty routine, she sneered, taking another step forward until she was practically breathing down my neck. You dropped out of medical school because you were too weak to handle the pressure. You brought absolute shame to our family name when you showed up pregnant at 24 by a man who did not even have the decency to stick around. Do you have any idea how humiliating it was for me to face my chapter sisters? To face my friends in the boule? I had to sit at luncheons and make up excuses for why my oldest daughter was suddenly a broke single mother living in a roach-infested apartment complex. You kicked me out, I reminded her, my voice slicing through her revisionist history like a scalpel. When the father walked out, you did not offer me a shoulder to cry on. You did not ask if I was okay. You told me to pack my bags that very night because a pregnant college dropout did not fit the pristine aesthetic of your country club lifestyle. I worked 3 jobs while pregnant just to keep the lights on. You never gave me a dime. You never bought a single box of diapers. Because you needed to learn a lesson, my mother snapped back without a single ounce of remorse in her eyes. I practiced tough love. I thought hitting rock bottom would finally force you to wake up and realize you needed to conform to our standards. But look at you. 10 years later and absolutely nothing has changed. You are 34 years old, wearing blood-stained scrubs to a holiday breakfast demanding respect you have not earned. She gestured wildly toward the dining table where Jasmine sat dripping in diamonds and designer silk. Look at your sister. Jasmine did everything right. She finished her education. She married a brilliant, successful man. Connor is building a technology empire that will secure our family's legacy for generations. Jasmine brings valuable connections to this family. She brings wealth. She brings pride. What exactly do you bring, Nia? You bring nothing but chaos, debt, and a terrible attitude. I stood perfectly still, letting her venom wash over me without absorbing a single drop of it. 10 years ago, a speech like this would have shattered me into a million irreparable pieces. I would have broken down in tears, begging for her validation, promising to try harder to be the daughter she wanted. I would have internalized every cruel word and let it poison my self-worth. But today, her insults felt completely hollow. They were the desperate, frantic ramblings of a deeply insecure woman who based her entire existence on the opinions of superficial strangers. You are right about one thing, Vivian, I said, keeping my facial expression completely unreadable. I do not bring the same things to this table that Jasmine brings. Exactly, my mother spat, crossing her arms triumphantly, believing she had finally battered me into submission. So take your ridiculous threats, take your bad attitude, and get out of my house. Connor's parents are flying out to Paris next week, and we are discussing international investments. We do not have the time or the patience to deal with your ghetto theatrics today. Take that filthy jacket off my clean floors and leave. If you ever figure out how to act like a respectable member of society, maybe we will invite you to Easter dinner. But until then, you and Maya need to stay out of our way. The mention of my daughter's name brought the cold, icy rage rushing right back to the surface. My mother had just justified throwing a 10-year-old child out into freezing temperatures by blaming my career choices and my supposed lack of social grace. She felt absolutely zero guilt. She felt entirely justified in endangering my daughter because in her twisted, elitist mind, poverty, or the appearance of poverty, was a moral failing that deserved to be punished. I looked past my mother and locked eyes with Jasmine, who was swirling her mimosa, with a smug, satisfied grin on her face. I looked at Connor, who was whispering something to his father, probably a joke about my scrubs. I looked at my father, Marcus, who was nodding along with every single toxic word my mother had just spewed. They all firmly believed they had won. They believed they had successfully put the black sheep back in her place. I reached into the deep pocket of my scrub jacket again, my fingers wrapping tightly around the thick manila envelope I had prepared. I could feel the sharp edges of the legal documents waiting inside. My mother thought she knew exactly who I was. She thought she had me entirely figured out. She had no idea that while she was busy bragging about Connor's fragile startup at her elite luncheons, I had been quietly building a healthcare monopoly that could swallow his entire company whole without even blinking. She had no idea that her insults were bouncing off a woman whose net worth eclipsed her entire social circle combined. I did not break eye contact with my mother as I slowly pulled my hand out of my pocket. I was done listening to her rewrite history. I was done letting her gaslight me into believing I was a failure. It was time to show Vivian exactly what kind of daughter she had actually raised. Before I could slide the thick manila envelope onto the glass table, my father's heavy fist slammed down against the solid mahogany wood. The sudden sharp crack echoed through the dining room, freezing everyone in place. I turned my head slowly, my eyes locking directly onto his. The smug, self-satisfied expression he had been wearing all morning was completely gone, replaced by a mask of absolute unfiltered contempt. Marcus was a man who viewed the entire world through the sterile lens of a balance sheet. To him, people were not family or friends, or even human beings. They were strictly either assets or liabilities. And in his meticulously kept social ledger, I had been written off as a toxic bankrupt liability a very long time ago. Put whatever pathetic grievance you are holding right back in your bag and shut your mouth, my father growled, his voice dropping an octave into that commanding, authoritative tone he used to intimidate his corporate subordinates. You do not get to storm into my house in dirty work clothes and speak to your mother that way. You lost that privilege the exact day you decided to become a spectacular disappointment. I stood my ground, refusing to shrink under his glare. A disappointment because I am asking why my 10-year-old daughter was thrown out into the freezing cold night. A disappointment because you have been nothing but a continuous string of massive failures since you were 24 years old, he fired back, taking a slow, deliberate step toward me. He pointed an accusing, rigid finger right at my face. Do not stand there and act like a victim, Naya. You had the world handed to you on a silver platter. You had a fully funded seat at Morehouse School of Medicine. You had a clear, unobstructed path to becoming a respected, prominent physician. You were supposed to elevate this family name. Instead, you got knocked up, dropped out, and threw your entire prestigious future straight into the garbage. The sheer, unadulterated venom in his words was suffocating. He deliberately and maliciously omitted the fact that when I discovered I was pregnant with Maya, her father had died in a tragic car accident just weeks later. I was devastated, violently grieving, and entirely alone. I had asked my parents for a brief leave of absence, a tiny moment of grace to gather my strength and figure out my life. Instead, they demanded I terminate the pregnancy immediately, so as not to ruin their pristine country club reputation. When I refused, they mercilessly cut off my tuition, locked me out of my college trust fund, and forced me to drop out. I had to scrub hospital bedpans and work grueling night shifts just to keep a cheap roof over Maya's head. But to Marcus, none of that context mattered. In his shallow eyes, a struggling single mother was simply a bad investment. Look at your sister, my father commanded, gesturing grandly toward Jasmine. Jasmine straightened her posture, lifting her chin with a triumphant, condescending smile. She practically glowed under his validation. Jasmine understood the assignment, my father boasted, his chest puffing out. Jasmine took her education seriously. She graduated at the top of her class. She earned her master's degree. She carries herself with the dignity, the grace, and the class that this family demands. She did not embarrass us in front of the entire elite community. I stared at Jasmine, watching her bask in our father's twisted, toxic praise. She was the golden child, the flawless, pristine investment that had finally paid dividends. She had never known the sharp, humiliating sting of a declined credit card or the absolute terror of an eviction notice taped to her door because our parents had paved her entire road with solid gold. My father was not finished. He turned his attention to Connor, placing a proud, heavy hand on his white son-in-law's shoulder. And look at exactly who she brought into this family. Connor is a visionary. He is the chief executive officer of a cutting-edge tech med company. He brings real tangible value to this table. He brings high-level business connections, corporate contracts, and actual undeniable prestige. He sits on charity boards. He introduces me to venture capitalists. My father turned his piercing, cold gaze back to me, looking me up and down with raw, unfiltered disgust. What do you bring, Nia? What have you ever brought to this family besides endless embarrassment and a constant string of complaints? You are a low-level nurse who changes bedpans and works night shifts just to afford basic rent. You bring absolutely zero value to this family name. The dining room was dead silent. Connor smirked, taking a slow, arrogant sip of his mimosa, clearly reveling in the fact that the patriarch of the family was openly worshipping him while publicly degrading his own flesh and blood. Connor's wealthy parents from Boston, sitting directly across the table, exchanged quiet, uncomfortable glances but said absolutely nothing to intervene. They were watching a public execution, and my father was the willing, enthusiastic executioner. I bring honesty to this family. I said, my voice perfectly steady, refusing to let him see even a microscopic fraction of the pain his words caused. I bring a strong, brilliant granddaughter who did not deserve to be treated like unwanted excess luggage last night. Maya is your responsibility, not ours. Marcus shot back, crossing his arms over his tailored custom suit. We are not your free childcare service. We have a major critical business acquisition happening this weekend. Connor's parents flew in from Boston to help finalize the details of a massive corporate merger. This house needs to be spotless. The environment needs to be strictly professional. We cannot have a loud child running around breaking expensive things and ruining the upscale atmosphere. She was sitting quietly on the couch reading a book. I countered the fire in my chest, threatening to burn straight through my careful clinical composure. She takes up less space than the 2 dogs you let sleep in your designated guest room. Those dogs belong to prominent investors, my father barked, stepping so close to me I could clearly see the furious veins bulging in his neck. Those investors are bringing massive capital into this family. What you do not seem to understand, Nia, is that the adult world runs entirely on leverage and assets. You have neither. You are 34 years old and you are entirely unremarkable. You have no network, you have no influence. You have absolutely no standing to walk into my dining room and demand a single thing from me. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping into a harsh, threatening whisper meant only for me to hear. You are lucky we even allow you to show up for the holidays. You are lucky we let you use our address on your mail to make yourself look respectable. But right now, you are jeopardizing a multi-million-dollar deal with your ghetto theatrics. You are making your mother upset, and you are disrespecting my highly successful son-in-law. I want you to turn around, walk out that front door, and do not come back until you learn how to speak to your betters with some actual respect. The sheer audacity of his worldview was breathtaking. He had completely deluded himself into believing he was the undisputed, untouchable king of a wealthy empire. He genuinely believed that Connor was his golden ticket to elite venture capital and white corporate validation. He had placed all of his bets, all of his pride, and all of his financial security on the fragile, arrogant man sitting at the table. My father had spent the last 10 years stripping me of my humanity, reducing me to nothing more than a failed medical student who did not deserve basic decency. He thought he could bully me into submission with loud words and aggressive posturing. He thought the heavy oak doors of his mansion protected him from the harsh, unforgiving realities of the actual business world. I looked directly at my father, studying the deep, arrogant wrinkles around his eyes and the expensive silk tie around his neck. I did not feel the familiar crushing weight of a daughter's heartbreak anymore. I did not feel the desperate, clawing need for his approval that had haunted my entire 20s. All I felt was the cold, calculated precision of an apex predator observing a very loud, very vulnerable prey. He had just given me the final necessary piece of justification to proceed without mercy. He had publicly chosen a failing, fraudulent son-in-law over his own daughter. He had openly quantified my entire human worth based strictly on my perceived bank account. It was a brutal transactional way to view a family, but it was incredibly liberating. Because if my father only respected money, power, and unyielding leverage, Then I was about to speak to him in the absolute only language he truly understood. Before I could utter a single syllable to my father, the heavy scraping of a chair against the floorboards shattered the tension. Connor stood up. He buttoned the center button of his tailored designer blazer with slow, deliberate arrogance. A patronizing half-smirk played on his lips as he stepped around the dining table, placing himself directly between my father and me. He was stepping in to play the white knight, resolving the minor inconvenience that was my existence. "Let me handle this, Marcus," Connor said smoothly, not even looking at my father. He kept his pale eyes locked entirely on me. His expression was a masterclass in corporate condescension. He looked at me the way one might look at a stray dog that had wandered into a pristine lobby. Connor reached into the inner breast pocket of his blazer. He moved with the slow, exaggerated patience of a man dealing with an erratic child. He withdrew a sleek leather money clip. With a sharp flick of his wrist, he pulled out a crisp, fresh $100 bill. He held it up between his index and middle fingers, letting it catch the light from the crystal chandelier above. "Listen, Naya." Connor started, his tone dripping with fake sympathy that barely masked the deep-seated racism underneath. "I understand that the holidays are stressful for people in your socioeconomic bracket. I understand that working long hours on your feet cleaning up messes for minimum wage puts you in a bad headspace. But you cannot march in here and project your financial insecurities onto this family." He took another step forward, extending the $100 bill toward me. "Take this," he commanded, lightly shaking the bill. "Go back to whatever neighborhood you came from. Buy Maya a nice big frozen turkey. Buy her a toy. Take the day off and relax. But you need to pack up this aggressive ghetto attitude and walk out that front door right now." The word hung in the air. Ghetto. He had dropped the microaggression perfectly wrapped in a deceptive layer of faux generosity. Jasmine let out a soft, impressed sigh from the table, gazing at her husband, as if he had just cured a major disease. My parents, Marcus and Vivian, visibly relaxed their shoulders, dropping as they let their wealthy son-in-law take complete control of the narrative. They were entirely complicit. They were perfectly fine with a white man calling their own daughter ghetto, as long as that man had a promising venture capital portfolio. Connor saw their approval and leaned into his perceived authority. His smirk widened into a full-blown smile of pure, unadulterated arrogance. "You see, Nia, today is a very critical day for the adults in this room." Connor continued, gesturing broadly to his parents, Preston and Beatrice, who were nodding along in unison. "We are dealing with big business today. We are finalizing high-level venture capital negotiations. My company is on the verge of closing a massive historic contract with the Apex healthcare system. We are talking about millions of dollars changing hands. We are talking about generational wealth and legacy building. These are concepts that you, quite frankly, could not possibly comprehend." He shoved the $100 bill slightly closer to my chest. "So do us all a massive favor," Connor sneered, his voice dropping its fake polite veneer. "Take the handout, go back to your little apartment. Let the people who actually contribute to society handle the real work. You are disturbing the peace, and you are making my parents incredibly uncomfortable. We have a timeline to keep, and your little temper tantrum is eating into our negotiation window." Beatrice, Connor's mother, finally spoke up from her seat at the table. She delicately wiped her mouth with a linen napkin before looking at me with absolute icy disdain. "Connor is being far too generous," she murmured, her nose wrinkled in disgust. "In our circles, such aggressive outbursts would result in an immediate call to the police. You should take his money and consider yourself extremely lucky, young lady." Jasmine chimed in immediately, eager to defend her new family. "You heard them, Nia. Take the money and leave. You have ruined breakfast enough already. Go buy Maya something nice and stop acting like the world owes you a living just because you made bad choices in your 20s. Connor is trying to help you. The least you can do is say thank you and leave us in peace." I looked down at the $100 bill pinched between Connor's fingers. It was a crisp green piece of paper that he firmly believed could buy my dignity, my silence, and my absence. He thought $100 was a massive windfall for a single mother working as a nurse. He thought he was exerting ultimate dominance. He thought he was untouchable because he was riding the high of a pending corporate contract with a healthcare giant. He had absolutely no idea that the very healthcare giant he was banking his entire arrogant existence on was solely owned and operated by the woman he had just called Ghetto. He had no idea that while he was busy printing fake financial projections to con my parents out of their mortgage money, I was sitting in my penthouse at 2 o'clock in the morning, personally signing the executive order to terminate his vendor contract with Apex Healthcare permanently. He was bragging about a deal that had already been reduced to ashes by my own hand. He was a dead man, walking financially bankrupt, entirely ruined, and he was currently trying to tip his executioner with a single $100 bill. The sheer magnificent irony of the situation washed over me, settling the fiery rage in my chest into a cold, glacial calm. I did not blink. I did not raise my voice. I did not give them the satisfaction of the angry emotional reaction they were all so desperately waiting for. I simply raised my hand and took the $100 bill from Connor's outstretched fingers. Connor chuckled, letting out a loud, triumphant breath. "There you go," he said, turning back to look at my father with a smug, victorious grin. "See, Marcus, sometimes you just have to speak to people in a language they understand. It is all about basic economics." My father nodded, deeply impressed by his son-in-law's crude display of financial force. "Well handled, Connor. Now, Nia, you have what you came for. Get out of my dining room before I lose what little patience I have left." I stood perfectly still, holding the crisp bill between my manicured fingers. I looked at the 6 people sitting around that lavish dining table. I looked at the crystal chandeliers, the silver serving platters, and the pure, unfiltered arrogance radiating from every single one of them. They had pushed me. They had insulted my child. They had stripped away my dignity, and they had tried to buy my submission. They had crossed the absolute final red line. There was no going back after this. There was no more playing the quiet, struggling nurse to keep the peace. I let the heavy silence stretch for 5 agonizing seconds, watching the smug smiles on their faces begin to falter slightly under my unwavering deadpan stare. I was not leaving. I was not retreating. The real business of the day had not even begun. The camera focus shifted smoothly from the crisp green $100 bill resting lightly between my fingers to the blinding sparkle of the massive diamond tennis necklace draped across Jasmine's collarbone. The morning light pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows caught the facets of the gems, throwing tiny, sharp rainbows across the expensive silk of her designer blouse. She noticed my gaze immediately. She had been waiting for me to look at it since the exact moment I walked into the dining room. Jasmine raised her manicured hand, her heavy engagement ring catching the light as her fingers delicately traced the line of diamonds at her throat. She let out a soft, breathy laugh that sounded exactly like shattered glass. "You like it?" she asked, her tone laced with absolute toxic pity. "Preston and Beatrice brought it down from Boston for me. A little early push present for their future grandson. It is a custom piece from a private elite jeweler in the Diamond District. But I am sure you already knew that, right, Nia?" "Oh, wait, no, you would not. The only jewelry you ever see is the cheap plastic watches your emergency room patients leave on their bedside tables." I kept my face entirely impassive. I let the $100 bill rest in my hand, neither accepting it nor throwing it back just yet. I wanted her to keep talking. I wanted to hear every single arrogant delusion she harbored in her head. Jasmine leaned forward, resting her elbows on the mahogany table. The diamonds swung heavily against her chest. "It is actually incredibly tragic," she continued, sighing dramatically for her audience. "Looking at you standing there in those filthy scrubs clutching a single $100 bill like it is going to change your life. It makes me realize how incredibly blessed my child is going to be. My son will be born into absolute generational wealth. He will have multiple trust funds before he even takes his first breath. He will go to the best private academies in Atlanta and then straight into the Ivy League. He will never know what it feels like to worry about keeping the heat on in the middle of winter." She paused to take a delicate sip of her mimosa, making sure the entire table was hanging on her every word. "And then there is Maya," she said, shaking her head with a look of manufactured sorrow. My poor niece. It breaks my heart, really, it does. We sent her back to that depressing little concrete box of an apartment last night, and I actually felt a tiny bit of guilt. I looked at her cheap little winter coat and those scuffed up sneakers, and I thought about what a completely bleak future she has ahead of her. My fingers tightened fractionally around the edge of the bill. Do not talk about my daughter Jasmine. I warned, my voice dangerously low. But Jasmine was riding the high of an audience that completely supported her. She felt untouchable. Why shouldn't I talk about her, Nia? Someone in this family needs to face reality. You are raising a fatherless child in a rough neighborhood on a public hospital salary. You are setting her up for a lifetime of relentless struggle. What kind of example are you setting? That it is perfectly acceptable to be a broke single mother who cannot even afford a babysitter on Christmas Eve. You are dooming that little girl to repeat your exact same pathetic mistakes. In 10 years, she will probably be dropping out of college pregnant and begging for handouts just like you did. The cruelty of her prediction was meant to break me. It was designed to make me burst into tears and flee from the house in absolute crushing shame. My mother Vivian nodded in solemn agreement, dabbing the corner of her mouth with a linen napkin. Jasmine is just speaking the hard truth, Nia, my mother added smoothly. It is painful to hear, but you need a reality check. Maya is a sweet girl, but she has no pedigree. She has no valuable connections. She has absolutely nothing to fall back on. In our social circles, a child without a solid foundation is entirely invisible. We cannot associate our pristine family brand with that kind of inevitable failure. Connor chuckled, wrapping his arm around Jasmine's shoulders and pulling her close. Do not stress yourself out, babe, Connor murmured, kissing the side of Jasmine's head. You cannot save people who do not want to be saved. Maya is going to end up exactly where people from her socioeconomic background always end up. It is basic statistics. We just need to focus on our son and the incredible legacy we are building together. Preston and Beatrice offered tight, polite smiles of agreement. Beatrice even reached over to pat Jasmine's hand, offering silent solidarity from one wealthy woman to another. Beatrice adjusted her cashmere cardigan, her pale eyes scanning my faded scrubs one more time. It is a shame, really, Beatrice said, her voice carrying that distinct Boston upper crust chill. My Connor works so hard to build an elite reputation in the medical technology sector. It is terribly inconvenient for him to be associated with this kind of chaotic family baggage. We advised him to maintain strict boundaries when he married into this family. Clearly, we were right to be concerned. My father practically tripped over himself to reassure her. Beatrice, please rest assured. Marcus pleaded, his voice practically dripping with desperation to please the White in-laws. Naya does not represent the standard of this household. We have already established strict boundaries. We are cutting off the dead weight. They were all sitting there, casually destroying a 10-year-old child's future over a gourmet breakfast, simply to elevate their own fragile egos. They needed me to be poor and miserable so they could feel rich and successful. They needed Maya to be a tragic charity case so Jasmine's unborn son could shine even brighter by comparison. I looked at the diamonds dripping from my sister's neck. I knew exactly how much a tennis necklace like that cost. Maybe $60,000 on a good day. It was a flashy, desperate display of new money. It was absolutely nothing compared to the quiet, invisible wealth I controlled. I had a separate, diversified investment portfolio just for Maya that generated more daily interest than Connor's entire annual salary. Maya's college fund was already fully vested and locked in a high-yield trust. She owned commercial properties in her name that my parents could not even afford to step foot in. My daughter was a multimillionaire disguised in scuffed sneakers and a cheap winter coat, and she was already 10 times smarter than anyone sitting at this dining table. I let a slow, dark smile spread across my face. It was not a smile of surrender. It was the smile of an apex predator watching its prey walk directly into a trap. You really think you have it all figured out, do you, Jasmine? I said, my voice echoing clearly across the expensive crystal and silver. You think a flashy diamond necklace and a husband with a loud mouth make you royalty? You think Maya is going to grow up and beg for scraps from your table? Jasmine lifted her chin, her eyes flashing with pure, unadulterated arrogance. I do not think it, Nia. I know it. It is the natural order of things. Winners win, and losers lose. You made your bed 10 years ago, and now you and Maya have to lie in it. And quite frankly, we are all completely exhausted by the smell of your failure ruining our holidays. I nodded slowly, letting her words hang in the air. The sheer volume of their collective delusion was staggering. They had built an entire alternative reality where they were supreme monarchs, and I was the lowly peasant. They were so deeply intoxicated by their own fabricated superiority that they could not see the massive shadow looming right over their heads. I did not need to defend Maya's future. Her future was already secured in solid gold. What I needed to do right now was completely obliterate theirs. I stood there, letting my silence stretch across the dining room, watching the smug certainty settle deeply into their faces. I was preparing to drop the first match on their fragile paper castle when my father cleared his throat with a loud, authoritative rumble. He sat up straighter in his heavy leather chair, pulling at the cuffs of his expensive, custom-tailored shirt. He exchanged a very specific, highly orchestrated look with my mother. It was a look of absolute ruthless agreement. They had clearly planned this exact moment. They believed they were holding the ultimate trump card, and my father was practically vibrating with the eagerness to play it. Since we are on the subject of reality and the future of this family, Marcus said, his voice echoing with the stiff formality of a boardroom dictator, there is an official legal matter that your mother and I have decided to conclude today. We were going to inform you by certified mail after the holidays to avoid any unnecessary emotional outbursts. But since you decided to crash our breakfast, we might as well handle it right now. Vivian folded her hands delicately on the table, resting her manicured chin on her knuckles. She looked at me, not with a mother's warmth, but with the cold, calculating stare of a corporate liquidator evaluating a worthless asset. Your father and I had a very long, very intensive meeting with our estate lawyers last week. She began, her tone clipped and precise. We have been conducting a thorough review of the family trust and the overall distribution of our generational assets. My heart did not skip a single beat, but I kept my facial muscles entirely rigid, giving them the illusion that I was bracing for a devastating impact. As you know, the primary purpose of the family trust has always been to ensure that our wealth and our legacy are preserved and multiplied for the future. Marcus continued, leaning forward and steepling his fingers. Wealth is a massive responsibility, Nia. It requires stewardship. It requires a certain caliber of intelligence, discipline, and strategic foresight to maintain. It is not a charity fund for those who refuse to apply themselves. He took a slow, deliberate breath, letting his eyes slide over to Jasmine, who was already glowing with an anticipatory, triumphant smile. Your sister has proven herself to be an exceptional steward of our family values, he said, his voice softening with genuine pride, before snapping back to pure ice as he looked at me. You, on the other hand, have proven to be an unstable, volatile liability. Every decision you have made since you were 24 years old has been a masterclass in financial and social self-destruction. Vivian nodded in solemn agreement, taking over the verbal execution. We have watched you struggle, Nia. We have watched you live paycheck to paycheck in that depressing little apartment. We have watched you drag Maya down into a life of mediocrity. And quite frankly, your father and I are terrified of what would happen if a substantial amount of capital ever fell into your irresponsible hands. We simply cannot risk our hard-earned legacy being drained by a broke single mother who does not even know how to properly budget for childcare. The utter sheer audacity of her statement hung heavy in the warm, vanilla-scented air. She was sitting in a dining room funded by a fake image, actively weaponizing her own granddaughter's perceived poverty as an excuse to commit the ultimate familial betrayal. So what exactly are you saying? I asked, my voice a flat, quiet monotone that they entirely mistook for defeat. I am saying that we have officially instructed our attorneys to restructure the entire estate. Marcus declared, his chest puffing out with absolute authority. We are transferring 100% of the family trust and all associated liquid assets directly to Jasmine's unborn son. You and Maya are officially being written out of the will effective immediately. Jasmine let out a soft theatrical gasp, placing a perfectly manicured hand over her flat stomach as if she was completely shocked by this news. Oh, Mom. Dad, you did not have to do that. She cooed, her voice vibrating with fake humility. Connor and I already have so much. We can easily provide for our son. Nonsense, Vivian insisted, reaching over to pat Jasmine's arm. It is the only logical choice, my darling. Your son is going to carry this family into the upper echelons of society. He will need trust funds for his private education, for his future business ventures, for his property investments. He is the future of this family. Connor nodded sagely, swirling the last bit of mimosa in his crystal glass. He looked at my parents with a serious, approving expression, playing the role of the wise financial advisor perfectly. It is a very prudent fiscal strategy, Marcus Connor said, his voice loud enough to ensure his wealthy parents from Boston heard every word. In the wealth management sector, we always advise our high net worth clients to consolidate their assets and protect them from high-risk beneficiaries. Leaving capital to someone without a basic understanding of compound interest or asset protection is essentially throwing money into an incinerator. I can have my wealth management team in Boston oversee the trust parameters to ensure the principal remains entirely untouched until my son turns 25. Preston and Beatrice Connor's parents exchanged looks of profound relief and approval. Beatrice offered a tight, aristocratic smile. It is always so difficult making these harsh familial decisions. Beatrice murmured, her pale eyes fixed on me with clinical detachment. But Marcus and Vivian are doing the right thing. One must protect the bloodline's resources from being squandered. It is simply the burden of the elite class. I stood there in my wrinkled hospital scrubs listening to an entire table of delusional narcissists and their white corporate in-laws actively conspire to financially disinherit a 10-year-old little girl. They were systematically, legally, and emotionally erasing Maya and me from their existence to fund a fetus that had not even taken its first breath yet. They were framing their breathtaking cruelty as responsible financial stewardship. They genuinely believed they were delivering a fatal, crushing blow to my spirit. They expected me to fall to my knees, to cry, to beg for a fraction of my inheritance, to promise I would change my life if they just kept me in the will. I did not beg, I did not cry. Instead, a profound, overwhelming sense of dark, comedic relief washed over my entire body. So just so we are completely clear on the record, I said, taking a slow, deliberate step toward the table, placing both of my hands flat against the cool glass surface. You are completely and permanently severing your own daughter and your 10-year-old granddaughter from the family estate. You are actively ensuring that Maya gets absolutely nothing, so you can pour every single dime you supposedly have into Jasmine's unborn child. We are doing what is necessary, Marcus said, his jaw set in a hard, uncompromising line. We are securing our assets. We will not apologize for making smart business decisions, Nia. You brought this entirely on yourself. You chose your path, and now you must live with the financial consequences of your absolute mediocrity. Vivian tilted her head, offering a sickeningly sweet smile of pure maternal poison. Try to look at it as a learning opportunity, sweetheart. Maybe losing this safety net will finally force you to grow up. Maybe it will motivate you to get a second job or go back to school for a useful degree. We are actually doing you a massive favor. We are finally cutting the umbilical cord so you can learn how to stand on your own 2 feet in the real world. The absolute irony of her words was so rich, it was practically intoxicating. Vivian and Marcus were sitting in a house they no longer owned, bragging about a trust fund that I knew, for an absolute verified fact, was currently bleeding cash. They were acting like billionaire titans of industry, bestowing wisdom upon a peasant while standing on a trap door that I controlled. They thought they had just cut my safety net. They did not realize they had just explicitly given me the moral and emotional clearance to cut theirs. They had just officially declared in front of witnesses that business was business and that protecting assets trumped family loyalty. They had just established the exact rules of engagement. I looked at the smug, self-satisfied grins plastered across Jasmine and Connor's faces. I looked at the cold, unyielding arrogance of my parents. They had fired their biggest weapon. Now it was my turn. I took a deep breath, ready to lay my cards on the glass table and watch their entire fabricated reality shatter into dust. But before I could utter the first syllable of their destruction, my father raised his heavy hand, commanding the room's attention once more. He simply could not resist the overwhelming urge to hear himself speak. The intoxicating thrill of performing his immense wealth for Preston and Beatrice had taken complete control of his fragile ego. He was not finished gloating. He had one more knife to twist, one more grand theatrical display of his financial acumen to parade in front of his wealthy white-in-laws. "Disinheriting you is merely a basic housekeeping measure, Nia," my father said, his chest puffing out beneath his custom-tailored shirt. "It is just clearing the dead weight off the ledger. The real business of today, the actual reason we are all gathered here to celebrate this Christmas morning, is about aggressive, expansive growth." I stood in silence and watched the faces around the mahogany dining table. It was like watching a slow panning camera slide across a room full of hungry, desperate predators. A subtle, identical look of pure, unadulterated greed passed from one person to the next. You could practically see the calculators ticking wildly behind their eyes, tallying up their impending economic benefits. "We are officially finalizing the paperwork today," Marcus announced, his voice booming with absolute pride. "Your mother and I are executing a massive capital injection into Connor's medical technology firm. We are pulling $2 million in raw cash to serve as the lead investors in his latest funding round." Vivian practically vibrated with excitement beside him, adjusting her silk robe to sit taller in her chair. "We are not just giving him the money," she corrected, her tone dripping with elite superiority. "We are purchasing a 10% equity stake in the company and securing a permanent seat on the board of directors. We are pivoting the family legacy from traditional real estate into the booming tech med sector." "Do you have any idea the kind of prestige this brings, Nia?" "Of course you do not. You have never understood high-level strategy. When this company goes public, we will be recognized as visionary angel investors. We will be hosting charity galas in Silicon Valley while you are still working double shifts to pay your utility bills." I stared at them, keeping my expression perfectly neutral, while my mind struggled to process the sheer breathtaking magnitude of their financial stupidity. $2 million in raw cash. I knew exactly what my parents' actual financial portfolio looked like, and I knew for a fact they did not have $2 million in liquid capital just sitting in a checking account. And exactly where is this $2 million coming from? I asked, my voice a flat, quiet monotone. My father offered a slow, condescending smile, completely eager to explain his brilliant financial maneuvering to a perceived simpleton. "We are fully leveraging our greatest asset," he declared proudly. "We have already initiated the paperwork to completely liquidate the remaining liquid capital in the family trust, and we are remortgaging this entire estate. We are extracting the maximum allowable equity out of this mansion to cross the finish line of Connor's funding round. It is a brilliant tactical move. You leverage dormant assets to create exponential active wealth." Connor leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, clasping his hands together, like a Silicon Valley guru about to deliver a TED Talk. "It is a mutually beneficial symbiotic relationship," Nia Connor explained. His voice dripping with technical corporate jargon meant to confuse and intimidate me. "My startup is currently in the hyperscaling phase. We have the infrastructure, we have the proprietary software, and we have the market demand. What we need right now is the bridge capital to secure the ultimate prize. With Marcus and Vivian's $2 million cash injection, I can finally execute the final expansion protocols required to land a historic exclusive vendor contract with the Apex healthcare system." He leaned back in his chair, taking a slow, victorious sip of his mimosa. "Once the Apex contract is signed and public, the valuation of my company will skyrocket past the $100 million mark. I am doing Marcus and Vivian a massive favor by letting them in on the ground floor. They provide the liquidity to secure the Apex deal, and in exchange I am making them wealthier than they have ever been in their entire lives. We are keeping the wealth strictly within the family. Well, the family that actually matters anyway. Preston and Beatrice nodded in solemn, approving unison. Preston tapped his crystal glass against the table in a gesture of profound respect. It takes a very strong stomach to play in the venture capital leagues, Marcus Preston said, his Boston accent thick with aristocratic validation. Most men your age are too terrified to leverage their homes for a business venture. You are showing incredible foresight. You are securing a dynasty for Jasmine and our future grandson. Thank you, Preston, my father replied, practically beaming under the validation of his wealthy white counterpart. You have to be willing to bet big to win big. And I believe in Connor's vision absolutely. Jasmine could not contain her smug satisfaction any longer. She touched the diamond tennis necklace at her throat, her eyes locking onto my faded hospital scrubs. This is what real power looks like, Nia Jasmine sneered. This is what happens when you actually apply yourself and surround yourself with winners instead of wallowing in poverty. Connor is about to lock down the biggest healthcare network on the East Coast. Mom and Dad are about to become tech billionaires. And you are standing there clutching a single $100 bill, trying to make us feel bad about kicking your kid out of a guest room. You are so entirely out of your depth, it is actually pathetic to watch. The sheer absolute lunacy of their master plan hung in the warm morning air. I looked at the six of them reveling in their shared delusion, wrapping themselves in a blanket of fake impending wealth. They were completely and totally blind. They had not just disinherited me to hurt my feelings. They had actively, eagerly bet their entire survival on Connor's arrogant promises. They were draining the absolute last drop of their actual cash, liquidating the final remnants of my grandfather's trust fund, and signing their names on massive high-interest loans just to feed a catastrophic fraud. My father believed he was a financial genius for remortgaging his mansion to fund a tech startup. He had absolutely no idea that he was signing fraudulent mortgage applications because he did not even own the house he was living in anymore. He was trying to extract equity from a property that had been foreclosed on and quietly purchased by my asset management firm 2 years ago. He was taking out illegal loans against my property to give cash to a man who was lying through his teeth. And Connor, the brilliant, arrogant tech visionary, was sitting there promising them exponential returns based entirely on a contract with Apex Healthcare. He was bragging about scaling his operations and dominating the market, relying completely on a signature from the chief executive officer of Apex. He had just looked the sole founder and owner of Apex Healthcare directly in the eye, handed her a $100 bill called her ghetto, and bragged about using her own company to make himself rich. They were all standing on a massive financial landmine, holding hands and gleefully jumping up and down on the trigger. They had handed me the detonator wrapped in a bright, shiny bow. I did not need to raise my voice. I did not need to scream or cry or beg for their respect. I just needed to let them finish digging their own graves before I politely pushed them all in. I did not speak. I simply stood at the edge of the dining room and let a faint, dangerous smirk slowly form on my lips. The silence stretched across the mahogany table, thick and suffocating. They had expected tears. They had braced themselves for a hysterical breakdown, a desperate plea for forgiveness, or a dramatic exit. My absolute glacial stillness unnerved them. I could see it in the way my father's jaw twitched, and the way Jasmine nervously adjusted her diamond necklace again. But their monumental arrogance quickly overrode any brief flash of human intuition. They mistook my predatory calm for the paralyzing shock of a defeated woman. My mother Vivian was the first to break the silence. She could not stand the fact that I was not crumbling under the weight of her grand execution. She smoothed the lapels of her silk morning robe and marched toward me, her face twisted into a mask of profound, absolute disgust. "Wipe that pathetic look off your face, Nia," my mother hissed, her voice sharp and brittle. "You think smiling is going to save you from the reality of your situation? You are standing in my formal dining room, tracking hospital germs onto my imported rugs and radiating the stench of cheap antiseptic and failure. It is completely nauseating." She gestured wildly toward Connor's wealthy white parents, who were sitting stiffly at the table. Beatrice actually raised a linen napkin to her nose, as if my very presence was polluting the expensive air she was breathing. "You are making our guests incredibly uncomfortable." Vivian continued, her tone dripping with elite indignation. Preston and Beatrice flew down from Boston to celebrate a multi-million-dollar corporate merger. They are accustomed to high society, to clean, pristine environments. They should not be forced to share their holiday breakfast with a sweaty, unkempt nurse who looks like she just crawled out of a public clinic. You are a visual and olfactory embarrassment to this entire family. I kept my eyes locked on hers, my smirk never wavering. The fact that she was prioritizing the delicate nasal passages of her racist in-laws over the daughter she had just disinherited was a masterpiece of narcissistic priority. "Since you clearly lack the basic social awareness to excuse yourself?" Vivian demanded, holding out her manicured hand, palm up. "I am going to make this extremely simple for you. Hand over your spare key. Right now." The room went dead silent again. This was it. This was the final physical severing of the parental bond. "You are revoking my access to the house," I asked, my voice perfectly level, betraying absolutely zero emotion. "I am permanently revoking your access to our lives," Marcus boomed from the head of the table, slamming his fist down for emphasis. "You are no longer welcome on this property, Nia. We are officially cutting our losses. We are building a tech and real estate dynasty with Connor and Jasmine, and we cannot have a desperate, broke single mother lurking around waiting for handouts. When Connor's company goes public and our investment triples, we know exactly what you will do. You will come crawling back here crying about how you cannot afford Maya's school supplies, begging for a slice of the pie. We are cutting off your last retreat before you even try to use it." Jasmine let out a cruel, high-pitched laugh. "Do not worry, Dad," she sneered. "Connor is already having the security company come out tomorrow to change all the gate codes and upgrade the biometric scanners. Even if she tries to sneak back in, she will not make it past the front lawn. We have to protect our assets from people who have nothing left to lose." They honestly believed they were leaving me destitute. They genuinely thought that by demanding this small piece of brass, they were locking me out in the cold, stripping away my final safety net, and condemning me to a life of perpetual poverty. They were so deeply intoxicated by their own fabricated superiority that they could not see the massive gaping hole in their logic. They were demanding the key to a house that I legally owned. They were changing the security codes on a property where I was the ultimate landlord. I looked at my mother's outstretched, demanding hand. I looked at the smug, victorious faces of my father, my sister, and my brother-in-law. They wanted absolute coldness. They wanted a permanent, irreversible separation. I was more than happy to oblige. I reached into the pocket of my scrub jacket, bypassing the thick manila envelope containing their financial ruin, and pulled out my keyring. I slowly, methodically detached the heavy brass key that opened their custom front doors. The metal was cold against my fingers. I did not hand it to my mother. I held it up, letting the morning light catch the brass, and then I dropped it. It hit the polished hardwood floor with a sharp, definitive clatter that echoed through the grand dining room. Vivian flinched, stepping back as if I had thrown a weapon at her. "There is your key, Vivian," I said, my voice dropping into a register of pure, absolute ice. "You want to sever ties. Consider them completely, permanently severed. You want to build a dynasty on the back of Connor's startup. I highly encourage you to pour every single dime you have into his promises. You want to make sure I never come crawling back for a piece of your pie. Do not worry. I have absolutely zero interest in the crumbs you are fighting over." Connor scoffed, shaking his head, as he took another sip of his mimosa. "Look at her trying to maintain her pride while she has literally nothing left. It is pathetic. Take your key and your ghetto attitude and get off our property, Nia." I did not break eye contact with my family. I let the full weight of my presence press down on them. They believed they had just won the ultimate victory. They believed they had successfully excised a tumor from their perfect, wealthy lives. They had no idea that they had just handed me the absolute moral clearance to drop the guillotine on their necks. "Enjoy your breakfast," I said, my voice soft, lethal, and completely devoid of any familial warmth. "Enjoy the champagne. Enjoy the feeling of sitting in this beautiful, expensive dining room. Because this is the absolute peak of your existence. It will never ever get better than this exact moment. I turned my back on them, feeling the collective weight of their arrogant stares burning into my spine. I did not rush. I walked with the slow, measured stride of a woman who held the entire world in her hands. I had given them every opportunity to show a single ounce of humanity. I had given them the chance to be a family. They had chosen to be ruthless corporate sharks. Now it was time to show them that they were swimming in an ocean entirely owned and operated by a much bigger, much deadlier predator. I reached into my pocket, grasping the thick manila envelope once more. The time for talking was officially over. The execution was about to begin. I stopped just inches from the grand arched doorway of the dining room. The heavy, suffocating silence of the house pressed in around me, broken only by the arrogant, self-satisfied breathing of the people sitting at the table behind my back. I could feel their collective gaze burning into my spine. They were fully expecting me to keep walking, to disappear through the front doors, and fade quietly into the freezing Atlanta morning as a defeated, broken woman. I held the crisp $100 bill Connor had given me in my left hand, while my right hand firmly gripped the thick manila envelope hidden deep inside the pocket of my scrub jacket. If a camera had been recording the room in that exact moment, it would have captured a perfectly static shot of absolute breathless stillness. There was no movement. There was no frantic energy. It was the terrifying, deceptive calm that immediately precedes a catastrophic Category 5 hurricane. I did not take that final step out of the room. I did not flee. Instead, I pivoted slowly on my rubber-soled hospital sneakers. I turned back to face the massive mahogany table, my posture entirely relaxed, and my facial muscles completely devoid of any tension or fear. The smug, victorious grins on their faces instantly froze. Their brains fundamentally misfired, unable to process why the vulnerable prey they had just slaughtered was suddenly turning back to face the predators. I raised my left hand, holding Connor's crisp green $100 bill up into the morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Connor let out a harsh, mocking scoff, naturally assuming I was coming back to beg for more of his charity. My father Marcus shifted his heavy weight in his leather chair, his face darkening with fresh irritation at my refusal to leave on command. I looked directly into Connor's pale, arrogant eyes. I did not blink. I brought my right hand up to meet my left, gripping the top edge of the currency. With a sharp, deliberate, and incredibly fluid motion, I tore the $100 bill straight down the middle. The sound of the crisp, premium paper ripping echoed with deafening clarity across the silent dining room. Jasmine gasped loudly, her hand flying up to clutch her diamond tennis necklace, as if I had just committed a physical act of violence. Beatrice Connor's wealthy mother from Boston let out a sharp, highly offended noise from the back of her throat. I did not stop. I placed the two torn halves together and tore them again, ripping the ultimate symbol of Connor's condescending superiority into jagged quarters. I opened my hand and let the useless, shredded pieces of green paper flutter down to the floor. They landed softly on my mother's priceless imported Persian rug like dead, worthless leaves. Connor's face flushed a deep, furious crimson. The smug tech executive facade vanished instantly, replaced by raw, unfiltered rage. He stood up completely, his chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. His hands balled into tight, rigid fists at his sides. "Are you entirely out of your mind?" Connor barked, his voice losing its polished corporate cadence. "You just destroyed $100 because your ghetto pride cannot handle taking a handout. You are completely psychotic, Nia. That is a federal offense." My mother Vivian looked down at the shredded money littering her immaculate rug, as if I had just dropped a live grenade into her pristine home. "Pick that up this instant!" Vivian shrieked, pointing a trembling manicured finger at the floor. "You do not come into my home and trash my property. You have completely lost your sanity." I did not break my stony gaze. I did not bend down to clean up the mess. I did not give them a single second to recover their equilibrium. I reached deep into the pocket of my faded blue hospital scrubs and pulled out the thick, heavy manila folder. This folder was the culmination of 2 years of meticulous, silent financial planning. It was 2 years of buying up their bad debt, monitoring their failing investments, and legally securing the absolute power to dismantle their entire lives with a few strokes of a pen. I walked straight back toward the dining table. I did not rush. My strides were incredibly slow, deeply measured and dripping with lethal, unyielding intent. I raised the heavy folder high and slammed it down onto the glass center of the mahogany table. The explosive smack sounded like a gunshot in the tense room. It violently shook the crystal champagne flutes and loudly rattled the silver serving platters. My father actually flinched, his broad shoulders jerking upward in pure defensive reflex. Preston Connor's aristocratic father spilled a bright orange drop of his mimosa directly onto the lapel of his tailored designer suit. I stood over the table, resting my fingertips lightly on top of the manila envelope. The manic defensive energy they had all been projecting suddenly collided head-on with my absolute chilling composure. I was not breathing heavily. My heart rate was perfectly steady. I looked at the six of them with the detached clinical precision of an emergency room trauma nurse, evaluating a terminal patient whose life support was about to be unplugged. The sheer discrepancy between my supposed status as a broke, desperate single mother and the terrifying, unshakable authority I was currently radiating caused a visible, violent ripple of panic to spread around the table. People who are truly powerless do not walk back to the executioner's block with a calm, deadpan smile on their face. People who have just lost their entire inheritance do not look at their disinheritors with a gaze of profound, absolute pity. My father's eyes darted nervously from the shredded money on his wife's rug to the thick, intimidating envelope resting under my hand. Marcus was a ruthless businessman, and his primal corporate instincts were finally starting to blare loud warning sirens in his head. He was suddenly realizing that he had severely mathematically miscalculated the situation. "What is the meaning of this?" Marcus demanded, trying to summon his booming patriarchal voice but failing to hide the slight tremor of uncertainty beneath it. "I told you to leave the property, Nia. I will not tolerate these dramatic, childish games in front of my guests." "We are not playing games, Marcus," I said, my voice dropping into a register so cold and authoritative that the entire room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "You wanted to talk about high-level business today. You wanted to discuss leveraging assets, aggressive corporate growth, and establishing dynasties. So we are going to talk about business. We are going to talk about exactly who holds the leverage in this room." Jasmine leaned away from the table, her previous bravado entirely evaporating under my stare. She instinctively grabbed Connor's arm, seeking protection from the sudden drastic shift in the room's power dynamic. "What is in that folder?" Jasmine asked, her voice barely above a nervous whisper. "Are those legal threats?" "Because Connor has the best corporate lawyers in Boston on retainer. You cannot intimidate us." Connor puffed out his chest, trying to regain the dominant stance he had lost the moment I shredded his money. "Do not engage with her, Jasmine. She probably printed out some fake cease and desist letters from the internet to scare us. It is a pathetic, desperate bluff from a woman who has absolutely zero capital to back it up." "If it is a bluff, Connor," I challenged him, tapping my index finger twice against the top of the folder, "then you should have absolutely no problem opening it. You are a visionary tech chief executive, are you not? You are a master of due diligence and financial stewardship. Open the folder and show my parents exactly what kind of brilliant, lucrative investment they are making today." Connor stared at the manila envelope as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. The eerie, absolute stillness of my posture was paralyzing him. He looked at his father, Preston, who gave him a stiff, encouraging nod to proceed. Connor swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously against his expensive silk collar. He reached out with a slightly trembling hand and pulled the heavy folder toward his side of the table. He flipped open the top cover, while my parents leaned in closely, completely unaware that the documents inside were about to reduce their entire affluent reality to ash. Connor stared at the first page of the dossier. From my perspective, looking right over his shoulder, I watched the exact second his arrogant tech executive facade shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The blood rapidly emptied from his cheeks, leaving his skin a sickly, pale gray. His eyes widened in pure, unadulterated terror as they darted frantically across the bold black text. His hands, which just moments ago had confidently brandished $100 bill to humiliate me, began to tremble violently. He abruptly slammed the folder shut, his breathing shallow and erratic. "This is garbage," Connor stammered, his voice cracking noticeably. He looked wildly at my father. "Marcus, this is entirely fabricated. She printed out fake financial audits to sabotage our deal. You cannot possibly believe this." I leaned forward, planting both my hands firmly on the glass table. "Open the folder again, Connor," I commanded, my voice slicing through the dining room with surgical precision. "Turn to page 3 and read the corporate bank statements out loud for the table. Read the exact negative balance of your primary operating account." Connor squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head. "I am not entertaining this psychotic delusion." "Fine," I said, maintaining my relentless over-the-shoulder stare directly into his panicked face. "I will read it from memory. Your highly touted medical technology firm ran entirely out of venture capital exactly 6 months ago. Your monthly burn rate is $400,000, and you have absolutely zero incoming revenue. You have pitched your so-called visionary software to 14 different angel investor groups in the greater Boston area over the last 2 quarters. Every single one of them laughed you out of the boardroom because your proprietary code is fundamentally flawed and entirely useless." My father leaned back in his heavy leather chair, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. "Naya, what are you talking about? Connor has a massive valuation. He is in the hyperscaling phase." "He is in the bankruptcy phase, Dad," I corrected sharply, never breaking eye contact with Connor. "He is drowning in massive, insurmountable corporate debt. 3 months ago, when he realized he could not secure a legitimate funding round, he took out a predatory bridge loan with a private equity firm just to make payroll and keep his leased office space. That loan matured last week. He is legally insolvent." Jasmine slammed her hand against the mahogany table, causing her diamond necklace to rattle against her collarbone. "You are a liar, Nia. Connor's company is booming. We are flying to Paris next month. He is about to sign the biggest contract on the East Coast. He is about to be indicted for corporate fraud." "Jasmine?" I shot back, my voice ringing with indisputable authority. "Look at your husband. Look at his face right now and tell me I am lying." Jasmine turned to Connor, her indignant fury faltering when she saw the sheer panic sweating from his pores. "Connor, tell them she is lying," Jasmine pleaded, her voice pitching up with sudden desperate anxiety. "Show them the projections." Connor opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He was completely paralyzed, trapped in the glaring spotlight of his own massive deception. He looked desperately across the table at his parents, Preston and Beatrice, hoping for a lifeline. But Preston had gone completely rigid, staring at the closed manila folder as if it were a live, explosive device. Beatrice was furiously twisting her pearl ring, her aristocratic composure fracturing under the immense weight of the truth. "Oh, I have not even gotten to the best part yet," I continued, my voice wrapping around the room like a tightening noose. "Let us talk about this brilliant $2 million cash injection. Let us talk about why Connor's wealthy parents suddenly flew down from Boston on Christmas Eve under the guise of a holiday surprise." I shifted my gaze to Preston and Beatrice, who both physically shrank back into their expensive chairs. "You two knew exactly what was happening?" I stated, my tone dripping with absolute disgust. "You knew your son was financially drowning. You knew the creditors were preparing to seize his business assets and potentially his personal assets. But you refused to bail him out yourselves because you did not want to risk your own pristine high society estate." Preston cleared his throat, adjusting his designer tie with trembling fingers. "This is an outrageous accusation," Preston blustered, though his voice lacked any real conviction. "We are simply here to celebrate our future grandson. You are here to oversee a heist," I fired back, instantly shutting down his weak protest. "You flew down here to help your son swindle my parents out of their mortgage money. You knew Marcus and Vivian were desperate for elite social validation. You knew they would blindly hand over $2 million in raw cash if Connor wrapped the request in enough tech jargon and false promises of generational wealth. My mother, Vivian, let out a sharp, horrified gasp, pressing her manicured hands against her chest. Marcus. Vivian whispered, her voice shaking with sudden raw panic. Marcus, is this true? The money. The remortgage. My father was staring at Connor, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. Connor. Marcus growled, his voice dropping into a deadly, threatening rumble. Look me in the eye right now and tell me this is a complete fabrication. Tell me the $2 million is going toward actual expansion protocols. Connor swallowed hard, sweat visibly beading on his forehead. Marcus, you have to understand the tech sector is volatile. Connor stammered, his corporate buzzwords failing him miserably. We hit a minor development snag. We just needed a temporary cash infusion to stabilize the runway until the major contracts close. The $2 million was just to bridge the gap. I was going to pay you back with massive interest once the valuation stabilized. The entire dining room erupted into absolute chaotic devastation. The pristine, perfectly curated holiday breakfast had instantly mutated into a catastrophic financial crime scene. My father roared in pure, unadulterated fury, realizing he had just willingly signed over the equity of his entire estate to a desperate con artist. Vivian slumped back into her chair, clutching her silk robe, as the horrifying reality of their impending financial ruin washed over her. Jasmine burst into hysterical tears, grabbing Connor's arm and demanding to know how they were going to pay for their luxurious lifestyle. You lied to me! Jasmine screamed at her husband, her pristine Spelman graduate facade completely disintegrating. You told me we were rich. You told me we were building an empire. I was protecting you. Connor shouted back, his own panic boiling over into defensive rage. If Marcus just signs the transfer today, we can fix this. The Apex healthcare deal is going to save us. It is going to cover everything. We just need that signature. He was still clinging to his imaginary life raft, even as his entire fraudulent existence burned to the ground around him. Connor was still desperately banking on the mythical vendor contract with Apex Healthcare to magically resurrect his dead company. He still believed he had an ace up his sleeve. He still thought he could somehow salvage this massive con by promising my parents a piece of a multi-million-dollar healthcare network. I watched him scramble. I watched him lie to his crying wife and try to placate my furious father. I let them scream and panic and turn on each other like cornered, desperate rats. I stood perfectly still at the head of the table, observing the absolute carnage with cold, detached satisfaction. Connor finally turned back to me, his pale eyes flashing with pure, hateful venom. This does not change anything. Connor spat, gripping the edge of the mahogany table. You might have hacked into my financial records, but you do not understand the big picture. You are just a nurse. You do not understand how corporate leverage works. Tomorrow morning, I am walking into the regional headquarters of the Apex healthcare system. I am sitting down with their executive board, and I am signing a vendor contract that will instantly inject $10 million into my company. My startup will be saved, my valuation will soar, and you will still be nothing but a pathetic, broke single mother standing in a house you do not belong in. He pointed a shaking, aggressive finger right at my face. So take your stolen documents and get out of here. You have not stopped anything. I am still going to win. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I looked at his desperate, sweating face and allowed a slow, chilling smile to stretch completely across my lips. The time for exposing his past failures was over. It was time to permanently annihilate his future. My right hand moved slowly from the top of the manila envelope, coming to rest on the cool, transparent surface of the mahogany-framed glass dining table. Tap, tap, tap. The sharp, rhythmic clicking of my manicured fingernails against the glass cut through the heavy, suffocating silence of the room. Every eye tracked the movement. It was the sound of a ticking time bomb reaching its final countdown. Tomorrow morning I repeated his words, my voice carrying a soft, terrifyingly pleasant cadence. You are walking into the regional headquarters of the Apex Healthcare System. You are going to sit down in the executive boardroom on the 50th floor, and you are going to sign a $10 million vendor contract that will magically resurrect your entire fraudulent existence. That is exactly right, Connor spat back, though his voice lacked the booming resonance it held just 5 minutes ago. He gripped the back of Jasmine's chair, his knuckles turning stark white. The legal teams have already finalized the red lines. The implementation schedule is set. The chief executive officer of Apex personally reviewed my software integration protocols and greenlit the funding allocation. So you can take your stolen bank statements and choke on them. You are looking at a man who is less than 24 hours away from securing a 9-figure valuation. I stopped tapping. The sudden absence of the rhythmic sound made the air in the room feel vacuum-sealed. It is fascinating that you mention the chief executive officer of Apex Healthcare, I said, leaning forward slightly, letting my medical scrubs brush against the edge of the dining table. Tell me, Connor, have you ever actually met her in person? Or have you just been dealing with the regional vice presidents and the lower-level acquisition managers who run the daily operations? Connor frowned, a flicker of genuine confusion crossing his pale features. Our legal teams interface directly, he blustered, attempting to recover his corporate swagger. The CEO is highly insulated. She delegates operational logistics to the Executive Acquisition Board. That is how multi-million-dollar healthcare empires are run, Nia. Not that a public hospital nurse would understand the first thing about elite corporate hierarchy. She is highly insulated, I repeated, nodding slowly as if deeply impressed by his business acumen. She delegates. She observes from the top floor while men like you desperately pitch broken, useless software to her acquisition teams praying for a lifeline. My father Marcus slammed his hand on the table again, clearly having reached his absolute limit of patience. Enough of these riddles, Nia. What does any of this have to do with you? Connor has secured the Apex deal. The paperwork is done. Your pathetic attempt to sabotage this family has failed. Now get out of my house. I did not look at my father. I kept my predatory gaze fixed squarely on my brother-in-law. The paperwork is not done, Connor, I said, my voice dropping all traces of amusement, becoming as hard and unforgiving as solid steel. The Apex Healthcare Vendor Contract specifically, Document 4A-7, outlines a $10 million phased integration of your proprietary medical technology across our southeastern clinical network. It was drafted precisely 3 weeks ago. It requires the physical signature of the chairman of the board to reach final execution. Connor's eyes widened fractionally. The fact that I knew the exact internal document reference number struck him like a physical blow to the chest. How do you know that, he whispered, his arrogant facade finally crumbling to reveal the terrified bankrupt con artist underneath? Those are highly classified proprietary corporate documents. How could you possibly know the contract code? I reached back into the thick manila folder and slowly slid a single crisp sheet of heavy watermarked corporate letterhead across the glass table. It stopped perfectly centered between Connor and my father. At the very top of the page, the unmistakable gold and navy blue crest of the Apex Healthcare System gleamed under the dining room chandelier. I know the contract code, Connor, I stated, letting every single syllable land like a hammer strike, because I am the one who drafted it. I know the implementation schedule because I am the one who approved it. And I know that your software is absolute garbage because my engineering team spent the last month tearing your code apart and confirming that it is nothing but a flashy, useless interface built on a failing architecture. The entire dining room stopped breathing. Jasmine's hand dropped from her diamond necklace. Beatrice and Preston stared at me, with their mouths slightly ajar, their elite Boston composure entirely shattered. I am the highly insulated Chief Executive Officer. I announced, the absolute power of the statement washing over them like a tidal wave. I am the founder. I am the sole owner. I am the chairman of the board of Apex Healthcare Staffing and Concierge Network. Connor physically stumbled backward, his legs hitting the edge of the dining credenza. No, he gasped, shaking his head in violent, frantic denial. No, that is impossible. That is a shell corporation. The CEO is listed under a blind trust. You are a nurse. You work the night shift at a public trauma center. I work the night shift to keep my clinical licenses active and to remind myself exactly why I built an empire that prioritizes actual patient care over greedy parasitic venture capitalists like you. I fired back, rising to my full height. I built Apex from my kitchen table 10 years ago, while you were all busy calling me a shameful ghetto disappointment. I used a blind trust because I knew exactly how my money-hungry status-obsessed family would react if they found out the daughter they threw away was suddenly worth 100 times more than their entire combined net worth. My mother, Vivian, gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning bone white, her perfectly applied makeup unable to mask the sheer, unadulterated horror washing over her face. Apex. Vivian choked out, her voice trembling violently. You own Apex, the company that is sponsoring the hospital gala next month. The company that was supposed to save your son-in-law from federal bankruptcy? I finished for her, my eyes locking onto Connor once more. I pointed sharply at the watermarked document resting on the table. Read it, Connor. Read the executive order I drafted at 2 o'clock this morning while I was taking a 15-minute break from saving gunshot victims in the ER. Read what happened to your miraculous $10 million lifeline. Connor leaned forward, his hands shaking so violently he could barely focus on the text. His father, Preston, snatched the document from the table, scanning the legal jargon with the desperate speed of a man watching his family legacy evaporate. Preston's face turned a horrifying shade of purple. He dropped the paper as if it had physically burned him. It is a termination notice, Preston whispered, his aristocratic voice completely broken. Effective immediately. For cause. Citing fraudulent capability projections and deliberate misrepresentation of software functionality. I canceled your contract, Connor, I declared, delivering the fatal crushing blow without a single ounce of mercy. I flagged your company in our internal network for attempting to defraud a major healthcare provider. By 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, every major hospital network on the East Coast will receive an industry-wide alert regarding your deceptive business practices. You are not going to scale. You are not going to dominate the market. You are not going to see a single dime of Apex money. Connor let out a guttural, wounded sound, grabbing his own hair, as his entire fabricated reality collapsed on top of him. The $10 million contract was gone. His professional reputation was permanently destroyed. His company was officially dead. Jasmine began to hyperventilate, her chest heaving as she clutched her husband's arm. Connor, she cried out, tears streaming down her perfectly contoured face, destroying her pristine Spelman alumni facade. Connor, tell me she is lying. Tell me we still have the money. We are supposed to go to Paris. We have the baby's trust fund to set up. There is no money, Jasmine. Connor screamed back at her, completely losing control, his voice cracking with hysteria. It is gone. It is all gone. The creditors are going to seize the house. They are going to seize the cars. My father, Marcus, collapsed back into his heavy leather chair, his hands gripping his chest as if he were experiencing a massive cardiac event. The terrifying reality of the situation was finally penetrating his thick, arrogant skull. He had just legally transferred the entire remaining liquidity of his family trust to a man who was now facing corporate ruin. He had signed the paperwork to remortgage his estate based on the guarantee of a contract that his own daughter had just unilaterally annihilated. My money, Marcus wheezed, his eyes darting frantically between me and Connor. The $2 million, the capital injection. Connor, you promised me a return. You promised me board seats. Your money is going straight to Connor's desperate creditors, Dad, I said, my voice echoing with profound, icy finality. The moment that $2 million hits his accounts, the private equity sharks are going to bleed it completely dry just to cover his outstanding bridge loans. You did not buy a 10% equity stake in a tech empire. You bought a front row seat to a federal bankruptcy hearing. Vivian let out a piercing, devastated wail, burying her face in her hands. The pristine, elegant holiday breakfast had transformed into a scene of absolute spectacular financial carnage. Connor's wealthy parents sat frozen in their chairs, their aristocratic superiority entirely erased by the crushing humiliation of their son's public exposure as a fraudulent failure. I stood at the edge of the dining room looking at the total destruction I had just unleashed. I had not laid a single finger on any of them, but I had surgically dismantled their entire future. The satisfaction humming in my chest was deep, primal, and incredibly liberating. But the masterclass in revenge was not quite finished. They had just lost their money, their status, and their future. Now it was time to take their home. If a camera had been filming this exact moment, it would have executed a violent whip pan directly to my father. Marcus was trembling so violently that the heavy mahogany chair beneath him actually vibrated against the hardwood floor. Thick beads of cold sweat gathered along his forehead and dripped down his thick neck, completely ruining the starched collar of his custom-tailored designer shirt. The terrifying reality of Connor's absolute corporate failure had shattered his fragile ego, but the stubborn, arrogant, patriarchal pride inside him refused to completely surrender. He slammed both of his heavy fists onto the glass dining table, rattling the silverware one more time. He pushed his massive frame out of the leather chair, gasping for breath, like a drowning man grasping at a tiny floating piece of debris. "This means absolutely nothing," Marcus roared, his voice cracking with desperate feral panic. He pointed a shaking finger at Connor, who was still slumped in his chair, weeping quietly. "You might have destroyed this pathetic fraud, Nia, but you have not destroyed me. I am Marcus Jackson. I built a real estate dynasty from the ground up. I do not need his garbage tech startup to survive. I still hold the ultimate leverage. I still hold the deed to this entire estate." Vivian immediately clung to his words, desperate for a lifeline. She sat up straighter, wiping a stray tear from her cheek, trying to salvage her aristocratic dignity. "Your father is right," Vivian sneered, her voice dripping with renewed toxic venom. "We are sitting inside a fully customized multi-million-dollar property. The equity in these walls alone makes us wealthier than you will ever be. We will simply go to a traditional bank on Monday morning. We will secure a conventional loan against this mansion, and we will rebuild our portfolio. We do not need your fake tech money, and we certainly do not need you." I looked at my parents, watching them desperately wrap themselves in the comforting illusion of their massive stone mansion. They genuinely believed that these four walls protected them from the harsh, unforgiving consequences of their own reckless actions. They firmly believed that no matter how catastrophic their business decisions were, they would always have this grand, sprawling monument to their elite social status. I reached into the thick manila folder for the third and final time. I withdrew a heavy stapled stack of notarized legal documents printed on thick premium paper. I did not slam these down. I laid them gently onto the glass surface, sliding them perfectly into the center of the table. "You are absolutely right about one thing, Dad," I said, my voice dropping into a register of pure absolute ice. "This estate is a magnificent piece of leverage. It is a stunning property. But you cannot extract equity from a house you do not actually own." Marcus scoffed loudly, wiping the sweat from his brow. "You have truly lost your mind, Nia. My name is on the deed. I built this house 20 years ago. I know exactly what I own." I shook my head slowly, letting a cold, predatory smile stretch across my face. "Do you, Marcus? Let us take a brief walk down memory lane. Let us talk about your disastrous commercial real estate venture in downtown Atlanta exactly 24 months ago. Let us talk about the massive shopping plaza development you poured your entire liquid fortune into right before the primary anchor tenants pulled out and filed for bankruptcy." The blood instantly drained from my father's face. The arrogant bluster evaporated from his chest, leaving him looking like a deflated hollow shell. Vivian turned to look at him, her eyes wide with sudden, unadulterated confusion. "Marcus, what is she talking about?" Vivian demanded, her voice trembling. "You said the downtown project was a massive success. You said we pulled out at the peak of the market." "He lied to you, Vivian," I stated clearly, my voice ringing with indisputable authority. "He lied to you to save his fragile pride, and he lied to his elite friends at the country club to maintain his fake billionaire persona. The downtown project was a catastrophic total loss. He defaulted on the massive commercial loans. And because he had aggressively leveraged this very mansion to secure that funding, his primary lenders quietly initiated absolute foreclosure proceedings on this exact property." Jasmine gasped, covering her mouth with her manicured hands. "No," she whispered, shaking her head in violent denial. "No, that is impossible. We never moved. We never packed a single box. We never saw a foreclosure notice." Because a private anonymous asset management firm swooped in and bought the distressed debt at the very last second, I explained, locking my eyes entirely on my father. A firm called Vanguard Holdings bought the note directly from the bank. They quietly paid off the outstanding balance and offered Marcus a highly confidential private lease to own restructuring agreement. They allowed you to stay in this house and pay an exorbitant monthly rent disguised as a mortgage payment, just so you could save face and avoid the profound public humiliation of being evicted in front of your wealthy elite neighbors. Marcus was shaking so violently he had to grip the edge of the glass table to keep his legs from buckling underneath him. His eyes were wide, wild, and entirely consumed by sheer terror. "It was a private contract," Marcus stammered, his voice barely a ragged whisper. "The non-disclosure agreements were ironclad. How could you possibly know about Vanguard Holdings? How did you get access to those highly classified real property transfers?" "I did not hack a server, Dad," I replied, taking a slow, deliberate step toward him. "I did not hire a private investigator. I know about the confidential lease agreement because I am the one who personally drafted the initial terms. I know about the exorbitant monthly rent you have been scraping together for 2 years, because those payments are deposited directly into a high-yield trust account bearing my 10-year-old daughter's name." The entire dining room stopped functioning. The oxygen was instantly sucked out of the space. Beatrice and Preston stared at me with their mouths hanging completely open, their aristocratic superiority entirely obliterated by the staggering magnitude of my financial checkmate. I tapped the heavy stack of notarized documents resting on the glass table. "These are the Vanguard Holdings Incorporation papers." I announced, the absolute power of the statement washing over them like a tidal wave. "I am the sole managing director. I am the sole owner. I bought your distressed debt, Marcus. I hold the deed to this property. I own the marble floors you are standing on. I own the crystal chandelier hanging over your head. I own the custom guest room where you let 2 dogs sleep while you threw my child out into the freezing night. Every single brick of this multi-million-dollar estate belongs entirely to me." Vivian let out a piercing, devastated wail. She collapsed back into her chair, clutching her silk robe as the horrifying reality of their impending absolute ruin washed over her. She was not the queen of a wealthy dynasty. She was a tenant living in a house owned by the daughter she had just spent the entire morning brutally degrading. Jasmine began to hyperventilate, her chest heaving as she clutched her diamond tennis necklace. She looked wildly around the pristine dining room, suddenly realizing that nothing she saw actually belonged to her family. The generational wealth she had been boasting about, the elite status she had weaponized against me, it was all an elaborate, complete illusion maintained entirely by my silent financial grace. My father, Marcus, dropped to his knees. The great, powerful patriarch, the man who measured human value strictly by bank account balances, was physically kneeling on my hardwood floor. His massive frame shook with deep, agonizing sobs of pure, unadulterated defeat. He had nothing left. He had liquidated his remaining trust funds to feed Connor's fraudulent tech startup, and he had surrendered his physical home to the daughter he had cruelly disinherited. "You let me believe I was saving the family." Marcus choked out, tears streaming down his face, ruining his custom-tailored shirt. "You let me pay you rent for 2 years while I treated you like a complete failure. I let you expose exactly who you are." I corrected my voice, cold, lethal, and completely devoid of any familial warmth. "I gave you the safety net you desperately needed, and I watched you use it to elevate a fraudulent white son-in-law while you systematically tried to destroy my child's future. You disinherited Maya this morning because you thought I was a broke single mother who would drain your assets. You thought you were cutting off my final retreat." I looked down at the 6 of them, reveling in their absolute, total destruction. They were completely broken, financially bankrupt, and stripped of their fake elite status. They had handed me the detonator wrapped in a bright, shiny bow. I did not need to raise my voice. I did not need to scream or cry or beg for their respect. I had just executed the most perfect, flawless financial retaliation in the history of this family. Now it was time to read the final sentence and permanently escort them out of my kingdom. I circled the massive mahogany dining table, my footsteps silent against the hardwood floor. I took my time observing the absolute devastation painted across their ashen gray faces. Marcus was still collapsed on the ground, gasping for air like a beached whale. Vivian was trembling violently, her luxurious silk robe suddenly looking like a cheap theatrical costume. Jasmine and Connor were entirely paralyzed, the horrific reality of their complete destruction finally settling deep into their bones. Preston and Beatrice looked physically ill, their aristocratic Boston composure shattered into microscopic pieces. I walked back to the center of the table and placed my hand flat against the thick manila envelope one final time. "I told you to open it, Connor," I said, my voice slicing through the heavy, suffocating quiet. "But since you are currently incapable of basic motor functions, I will gladly summarize the remaining documents for you." I pulled a crisp, notarized letter from the folder and slid it directly toward his trembling hands. "This is a formal, immediate termination notice from your own board of directors. When I flagged your company in the Apex Healthcare Network for fraud, I also took the liberty of contacting your primary venture capital investors. They held an emergency board meeting at 6 o'clock this morning. You have been officially ousted as Chief Executive Officer of your own startup. They are immediately liquidating whatever useless assets you have left to pay off those predatory bridge loans. You do not even have a desk to clear out on Monday." Connor let out a wet, pathetic gasp. But I was already turning my attention back to my parents. I drew a second document from the folder, a stark, legally binding form, and placed it precisely in front of my mother. Vivian stared at the paper as if it were coated in lethal poison. "That is a formal 30-day eviction notice." I stated, my tone entirely devoid of any human sympathy. "Vanguard Holdings is officially terminating your private lease agreement. You have exactly 1 month to pack up your designer clothes, your crystal champagne flutes, and those 2 precious aristocratic poodles, and get off my property." Vivian let out a strangled, suffocating sob, reaching out with shaking hands. "Nia, please, you cannot do this to us. This is our home. Where will we go?" "You wanted to ensure Maya and I were permanently cut out of this estate," I reminded her coldly. "You got exactly what you wanted. You no longer have an estate. You are simply bad tenants who have defaulted on both your social and financial obligations, and your landlord is officially kicking you out onto the street." My father remained on the floor, utterly broken, unable to even lift his head. I looked down at him, feeling absolutely nothing. "That is a fantastic question, Vivian." I continued, my voice ringing with absolute finality. "Where will you go? Perhaps Connor's wealthy parents can offer you their guest room in Boston. Or maybe you can use that single $100 bill Connor so generously offered me to secure a cheap motel room in the same impoverished neighborhood you constantly mock. You have 30 days to figure it out." Jasmine let out a gut-wrenching wail that shattered the last remaining illusions of her perfect life. She dropped to her knees beside Connor, clutching her ruined diamond necklace, her pristine Spelman alumni facade completely disintegrating into loud, ugly sobs. She realized with absolute horrifying clarity that she was no longer the wealthy golden child. She was the wife of a disgraced, unemployed fraud, and the daughter of 2 bankrupt tenants who were about to be thrown out onto the street. Vivian, seeing the absolute destruction of her empire, suddenly shifted her tactics with terrifying speed. The cold, calculating matriarch vanished instantly, replaced by a frantic, weeping mother desperate to salvage whatever she could. Vivian scrambled to her feet, tears ruining her expensive makeup, and rushed toward me with her arms outstretched. "Nia, please." Vivian cried, her voice cracking with manufactured maternal desperation. "You cannot do this. We are family. Blood is thicker than water, Nia. I am your mother and I love you. We can fix this. We can be a real family again, just like you always wanted." If a camera had been capturing the room, it would have slowly dollied backward, emphasizing the vast, insurmountable physical and psychological distance that now permanently separated me from them. As Vivian lunged forward to wrap her arms around me in a fake, desperate embrace, I simply took one calm, deliberate step backward. I smoothly, completely dodged her touch. Vivian stumbled, her hands grasping at empty air before she caught herself against the edge of the glass table, looking at me with wide, terrified eyes. "Do not touch me, Vivian," I commanded, my voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper that froze her perfectly in place. "Do not insult my intelligence by weaponizing our bloodline only when your bank account is completely empty. You did not care about my blood when you let Connor call me ghetto. You did not care about family when you tried to steal my inheritance to fund a scam." I looked at the 6 broken people scattered around the dining room. I let the absolute finality of my decision wash over them, stripping away their last shred of manipulative hope. Last night, there was absolutely no room for my innocent daughter at this holiday table. I stated every word, striking them like a physical blow. Today, there is no room for you in our lives. The camera slowly transitions, fading from the absolute wreckage of my parents' dining room back to the present moment. I am sitting comfortably on a plush velvet sofa, bathed in the warm golden light of the late afternoon sun. A soft, peaceful smile rests on my face. The heavy, suffocating tension of the past is completely gone, replaced by the quiet, unshakable serenity of a woman who successfully protected her peace. The fallout from that Christmas morning was as swift and spectacular as I promised it would be. Connor's venture capital investors did not just fire him, they filed a massive class action lawsuit against him for corporate fraud and gross financial mismanagement. He was stripped of every single asset he falsely claimed to own. Jasmine completely lost her pristine rich wife facade. She was forced to sell her beloved diamond tennis necklace and her designer bags just to pay for Connor's mounting legal defense fees. The golden child finally had to face the harsh, unforgiving reality she used to mercilessly mock me for. As for my parents, Vivian and Marcus, they were officially evicted exactly 30 days after our holiday breakfast. Stripped of their stolen trust funds and their fake billionaire status, they had absolutely no choice but to downgrade their entire existence. They currently rent a dingy, cramped 2-bedroom apartment in the exact same impoverished neighborhood they spent my entire life looking down upon. There are no more country club dinners or elite sorority luncheons. They spend their days entirely isolated, trapped in a prison of their own arrogant creation. I take a slow, deep breath of the perfectly climate-controlled air in my actual living room. I am not sitting in that freezing, drafty decoy apartment. That place was merely a prop, a physical reminder of where I started, and a necessary shield to protect my true assets from their predatory greed. I am sitting in my real home, a multi-million-dollar luxury penthouse with sweeping floor-to-ceiling windows that offer a breathtaking panoramic view of the entire Atlanta skyline. Every piece of custom furniture, every original painting on the wall, and every square inch of this magnificent space was bought and paid for entirely by my own hard work. I hear the joyful sound of footsteps echoing across the polished marble floor. Maya runs into the living room, her face glowing with pure, unadulterated happiness. She climbs onto the sofa and wraps her arms around my neck, burying her face in my shoulder, just like she did on that freezing Christmas Eve. But this time, she is completely safe, entirely warm, and thoroughly loved. I hold my brilliant, beautiful daughter tightly against my chest, resting my chin on top of her head. I look directly into the camera, my smile widening with absolute unbreakable certainty. Family is not blood that throws you away when you are no longer convenient. Family is whoever builds an empire with you, making sure no one can ever kick you out of your own table. The screen slowly fades to black.